at second reading of Bill C42, Common Sense of Firearms Licensing Act. This bill, Mr. Speaker, seeks to bring reforms that will clarify and simplify the delivery of firearms licenses while maintaining the reliability of this system with the primary goal of protecting Canadians' safety. I would now like to describe how this bill will improve our licensing system. Currently, there are two types of firearms licensing available: the possession license and the possession and acquisition license. Now, the possession and acquisition license is the only one available for new firearms owners. That is the one I use myself, and I have since January. I followed a training session, and then I went through different administrative procedures in order to obtain this possession and acquisition license, or as it is called, the PAL. So, as its name says, this license allows us to possess and acquire a gun. Now, this the other possession license, was created 20 years ago by the Liberal government as a transitional measure for firearms owners who wanted to avoid the authorization regime. Now, the average age of these owners is close to 60 years. They are all experienced and competent people, and they are people who know how to use these firearms and who can also borrow and buy ammunition. So what are we seeking to do with this bill is simply to merge the system, to simplify it, and to combine the two licenses, these two types of licenses, Mr. Speaker, which would entitle some 600,000 owners of firearms who are law-abiding to acquire a firearm. We can understand that after 20 years, it is time to, people might want to renew their firearms. We might remember at the time that this was an initiative that was proposed by the late Jack Layton, who was the former leader of the New Democratic Party.
Secondly, we are addressing a serious issue that impacts every firearm owner. Currently, if an individual makes a paperwork error and does not renew their license on time, they are liable to face a minimum sentence of 3 years in prison. Some people, Mr. Speaker, may be deployed or traveling abroad. They can be under medical treatment and be turned into a criminal overnight because they have not renewed on time their firearm. That is why this bill, Mr. Speaker, puts in place a 6-month grace period at the end of a 5-year license. Soyons clairs, Monsieur le Président.
Let us be clear, Mr. Speaker. This waiting period, this grace period, will not allow the purchase of firearms or ammunition, but it will prevent people from being considered criminals simply because there was an administrative delay in the renewal of that person's license.
Next, continuing in the area of licensing, this legislation will improve the way the authorization to transport system works. And I certainly invite the leader of the second opposition to read the bill so he would not attempt to mislead the House as he has tried to do today. That in no way the way to transport a restricted firearm in this country is impacted by this bill. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what the opposition of the leader of the second opposition has pretended. But as you've mentioned, the truth will prevail, and this is exactly what is happening right here, Mr. Speaker, as I am presenting this bill. So let's get on to this, move on to this bill, and we'll let our little Liberal friend yell over there, and he'll have his time to debate as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I was explaining to you that we have a grace period for law-abiding citizens that after 5 years are willing to renew their license. That's one first improvement of this bill. As I was interrupted, I was also indicating that we are improving the authorization to transport And I would invite the member to listen, because maybe then there won't be any more attempt to mislead the House, Mr. Speaker. So as I was just saying, currently, an authorization to transport is required to take any restricted firearm between the owner's home and another location. Each and every new location requires a separate form and application, Mr. Speaker. Are we changing the way to transport a restricted firearm in this country, Mr. Speaker? No. But are we cutting into red tape, Mr. Speaker, for law-abiding citizens? Yes, Mr. Speaker. This is exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. So let's have a honest debate here. Let's talk about the truth, about the fact, and about the fact that it is very important, Mr. Speaker, to keep our safeguard, to keep this country safe, and to keep the measure this government is applying to keep Canadians safe. So, Mr. Speaker, you have to know that those I would say this red tape, those papers are not even shared with law enforcement. They are useless. This is a good example of red tape without any added value. And I hope the Liberal, actually, the opposition leader, the critic, will clearly understand what this bill is all about, and then we can have an open and frank discussion. So, Mr. Speaker, this information, as I've just mentioned, not only is not shared with law enforcement, but is second only to the registration of long guns. This process is the clearest example of needless red tape and burdensome paperwork brought in by the former Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. And my question would be at this point in time, Mr. Speaker, what do have the Liberal Party against law-abiding citizens, Mr. Speaker? This is the question I hope the honourable member will be answering as he'll be given the opportunity to speak on that bill, which is bringing cutting red tape while increasing the safety of Canadians, Mr. Speaker. So let me go on, Mr. Speaker, because this is why this bill will eliminate the need to apply for new authorization, new red tape, Mr. Speaker, to transport a firearm for any lawful activity within the province where the firearm owner resides. What are we talking, Mr. Speaker? We are talking to go to a shooting range. We are talking to go to the gunsmiths to have a firearms repaired or fixed. And we are talking, in some cases, to go to some exhibition, Mr. Speaker, where people can exchange and share their views and their passion for their activity. Il est important de rappeler, Monsieur le Président.
It's important to remember, Mr. Speaker, that all restricted weapons have to be transported, unloaded, locked up, and in a closed chest. It is recommended to always transport them in the trunk of a vehicle.
Here, an opportunity to educate my honourable colleague on the other bench, maybe the leader of the second opposition, who maybe have a need to refresh his knowledge on the way to carry a restricted firearm in this country, Mr. Speaker. Let me be clear. This firearm has to be unloaded. It has to be trigger lock. It has to be in a locked case, Mr. Speaker, and preferably in the trunk of the car with an owner of a valid, restricted firearms, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? We will keep this because we feel that this is important, Mr. Speaker, that we keep on the same way, Mr. Speaker. But while doing this, Mr. Speaker, we also feel it is important to cut red tape for those law-abiding citizens, and that's why we are bringing those change forward, Mr. Speaker. Alors, toute personne qui
Any person transporting a restricted weapon must take the most direct route towards their destination, Mr. Speaker. That is what the law currently says. These rules are not changing because they're safe and sensible. They're common sense, Mr. Speaker.
Firearm Licensing Act. What will be eliminated is the needless paperwork that law-abiding sport shooters were previously required to complete in order to engage in their hobby. Mr. Speaker, while the crux of the Common Sense Firearm Licensing Act is, as its name suggests, the licensing of firearms, there are two other important measures tackled by this bill. First, this bill will just simplify the way and make it that this is a federal law, Mr. Speaker, under the criminal code. So isn't it logic that this law be applied the same way across the land? Well, this is what this bill is willing to accomplish. while making law enforcer applying the law and legislator setting the rules. So that's how we're going to, Mr. Speaker, make sure that the authority of the Chief of Firearms Officer is clearly defined in the law so that it is applied in a standardized way, Mr. Speaker, and that there are no discrepancies amongst one region of another. After all, we are the same country, this is the same law, and this is the same criminal code. So, Mr. Speaker, les lois d'armes à feu sont des lois canadiennes.
Firearms laws are Canadian laws, and I firmly believe there has to be a Canadian standard for the implementation or the enforcement of these laws, and that's exactly what this bill is proposing to do, to simplify and make uniform the licensing regime.
Comments today to decisions that created criminals out of law-abiding citizens overnight. Well, Mr. Speaker, many Canadians were shocked to realize that some owner of illegal firearms for years, for decades, were turned into criminal overnight, Mr. Speaker. This is not acceptable. That is why we are addressing this issue in that bill. The Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act will end the ability of the Canadian Firearms Program to make a final decision on reclassification of firearms without an oversight by elected member of parliament. So why are we doing this, Mr. Speaker? Because the law-abiding owner of the Swiss arm and the seized firearm, Mr. Speaker, are law-abiding citizen and should not be treated as criminal. And this is why we are bringing this legislation forward for that specific part. So therefore, the government will have an oversight mechanism for decision on the classification of firearms. And once again, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, these decisions will be taken on the advice of technical experts who are knowledgeable about the workings of firearms. To that end, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what will happen to the CZ and the Swiss Arm family of rifles to have the original reclassification restored when the bill is proclaimed into law, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, ce sont...
Mr. Speaker, these are important measures to bring common sense back into our firearms policies. And as I said earlier, my first priority is to keep the safety, ensure the safety of Canadian public thanks to sensible policies.
That has been about disarming all Canadians. It was about making hunting and sport shooting so onerous, so filled with time-consuming paperwork that no one would be interested in pursuing these Canadian heritage activities, Mr. Speaker. Many members around here, Mr. Speakers, have grown on a farm or have their parents having grown on a farm or their grandparents having grown on a farm, Mr. Speaker. This was part of their life. This was part of their way of living. And many of our friends and colleagues like hunting, like sport shootings, Mr. Speaker. They are law-abiding citizens, Mr. Speaker. Why should they be ostracized because they are doing those Canadian heritage activities, Mr. Speaker? Well, we have a common sense firearm licensing regime that is there to make sure that they are abiding by the law, but in the meantime, we are cutting into red tape. So that's what this bill is all about. That's what we are seeking to achieve with this bill.